Hey everybody, and welcome back. In the next four Sweatpants BI videos, I'm actually going to walk you through from start to finish how to build a Power BI tool. Instead of focusing on just one specific aspect of building a tool, I thought that it might be really, really useful for some of my viewers and some of my students who are newer to Power BI to actually see me spend about 2 to 3 hours going through all of the different steps that it takes to build even a fairly basic Power BI report. So in these four videos, I'm going to be using a data set compiled from a movie database that contains about 16 to 17,000 movies over a little over a century, including the directors, the actors that were in the movies, the writers, their ratings, the studios that produced those films, things like average critical reviews, average audience reviews, quite a bit of information about each movie. But it's not an extraordinarily complex data set. Most of the things that we're going to do are pretty straightforward. There might be a little bit of DAX, but by and large, I'm going to show you how to model that data in the Power Query editor. I'm going to show you how to build quickly some just very basic data visuals. I'm going to spend some time sort of bouncing back and forth between PowerPoint and Power BI to show you how to build a really amazing layout and how to use color to make really clean and attractive looking visuals in an otherwise clean and attractive looking Power BI report. And then in the last video, I'm going to walk through some slightly more advanced user features in Power BI, things like bookmarks, drill through pages, and report page tooltips to show you how to make a more immersive and interactive experience for your users, with reports that are full of things that your users are going to want to click on, hover on, in order to sort of get more from that data. So there's going to be a lot of kind of mini tutorials along the way. In this first video, like I said, I'm going to start by just opening up a fresh PBIX file in Power BI Desktop, walking through how to connect to a CSV file, walking through some very basic tips for modeling out your data, cleaning up your data, so that when we get to the front end, we've got plenty to work with that's already ready to go for us to start building some data visuals in the second video. So let's go ahead and kick things off by getting into Power BI, and let's get connected to our data and get going with, like I said, just some very basic tips in the Power Query editor. So let's go ahead and head up here to our Power Query editor or transform data button, depending on which version of the tool that you have. If I drop it down the rest of the ribbon, you can see that it's called transform data. And if you roll it up, it doesn't have a title, but it's right here. It's just a table with a little pencil on it so that you can edit your data. Let's go ahead and head over to our Power Query editor environment. You can see that I currently have no tables loaded because this is a brand new PBIX file that I've just started. I'm going to head up here to new source so that we can connect to some data. And I'm going to be connecting to a CSV in this case. This is going to be a CSV file that contains about 16,000 rows of movie data. So I'm going to go ahead and head over to my movie data walkthrough folder. I've got RT movies, that's my file. And I'm going to go ahead and bring this in, make sure that everything is looking great, basically making sure that I don't have any like trailing columns or anything. And I'm going to go ahead and hit OK and connect to my movies. Now, something that I like to do when I'm building Power BI tools is I like to take just the raw data set and just keep a copy of it. Basically, I'm going to go ahead and just reference this the first version of the data set that I brought in. I'm going to right click on it. I'm going to turn off enable load. And when you turn off enable load, what you're doing is you are keeping this table from loading to the front end of Power BI. So I won't be able to actually use anything in this table that is italicized in my data visuals because I have disabled the load. But it's at least a way of kind of keeping your source data there where you can see it at all times. In fact, I'm going to call this RT movie source. So the next version of the file is what I'm actually going to start transforming and cleaning up here. So, if you have the time, I know sometimes, you end up with tables that are like 100 columns deep. And so it may not always be practical to go through and change the name of every single title. for each of your columns. But since this is just 17 columns of data, I am just going to go through very quickly, just double clicking on each column name. You can see I made a typo. I'm actually just going to go up here into the formula bar and fix the title there. I'm going to go through just super quickly. Just give everything in my data set nice clean names to work with. Honestly, this doesn't really do anything for me as a Power BI developer, but in the event that I should have users or my stakeholders seeing these column names, I don't like having the underscores and everything. I want this to be as readable as possible. And of course, it doesn't take very long at all for me to go through and update these titles. If you, as I'm going through this, I'm realizing I don't think that the Tomatometer rating was called that. You can always go back up into your formula bar and make some changes on the fly if you need to. Almost done here. Okay, so that was pretty easy, just updating all of my column names. Now let's just actually go through the data and look for major things that we're going to need to fix before we would start actually visualizing this data. Right away, I'm noticing we've got all of our movie titles over here. For the most part, these are looking pretty good. I've got about 1,000 rows of data here to sort of profile everything. That looks good. I've got a couple of fairly large text blobs here, that I might be a little bit concerned about from a performance standpoint. This movie info column in particular, has really long text values that kind of describe each movie. Could be interesting, but that data could be kind of hard to model or consume visually because it's just a bunch of words. So I'll make a mental note that maybe I want to revisit, making a word cloud or something for this data if I think that that's going to be a decent way of visualizing it. I've got critics consensus, which looks like it's not always filled in, but that's fine. I have my different ratings, just literally rating the maturity level of some of these different movies, all the way from G to probably beyond R, possibly even like NC-17, for super adult films. I'm starting to get into some more interesting things here. Notice that the genre field contains multiple values for any given row. So it looks like for this first movie here in row 1, Percy Jackson and the Olympians, looks like this movie transcends 4 or 5 genres: action, adventure, comedy, drama, sci-fi, fantasy. So it would be a better user experience if I were able to break out all of these genres instead of kind of having them all lumped together. It could make it really hard for a user to search dramas if they had to depend on knowing all of these different combinations of genres. So I'm making a mental note here that this looks like a column that I'm going to have to model out. And now I'm running into quite a few of these examples. Notice here that in director, I'm ending up with the same situation. I'm ending up with multiple names here that look like they're the same person: Gregory Jacobs, Greg Jacobs, and Gregory Jacobs. This is probably a rare situation that I may not be able to fix because I'm noticing here that all 3 of these names are probably the same person, would be my guess. But down here there are 3 directors. Only 2 of them look like they're probably the same person. So there may be some things in this that I can't necessarily fix. We'll cross that bridge when we get to it. Looks like I have multiple writers for any given movie. That's a little bit more common and to be expected. Obviously, my cast column contains, I would guess upwards of 50 to 100, cast members for any given movie. So there's a lot of cleanup here that I'm going to have to do that's probably going to drastically increase the size of my data model. All of that's fine. I'm just going through and looking for anything that I think might stand out as something that I'm going to have to fix before visualizing this data. As I scroll down through all of these names, I'm also just kind of keeping an eye out for any names or anything that look like they've maybe been manipulated or not converted well in the translation of the CSV into Power BI. Sometimes you end up with like weird symbols in the data, but fortunately, it doesn't look like I'm seeing too many of those. If they come up, that's something that we can always fix after the fact. And then everything else is looking good. My in-theaters date, my on-streaming date, those have been correctly converted into date columns. That's great. I've got my runtime here in minutes, studio name, tomato meter, and just my tomato meter rating and my audience rating, basically indicating, the higher the better in terms of rating the films. So overall, the data set's pretty straightforward. That's another reason why I picked it. But we need, as I mentioned, there are some fields in this data set that contain multiple values that we are going to have to model out. So let's go ahead and change the name of our main table here to RT Movies Main. And real quickly, I'm going to go to Add Column, and I'm going to add an index column, which is basically just serving as like a row count here. And I'm going to go ahead and add that to my main data set. And if you want to move this to the beginning of the data set, that's absolutely fine. So now we have an index in our table, and this is going to be extremely important for some of the transformations that I'm about to show you. So let's go ahead and duplicate this table. And the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to start breaking out these genres. So let's go ahead and get rid of all the noise in this table. I'm going to go ahead and just hold down Control, and I'm going to select my index column and my genre column. I'm going to right click and I'm going to remove all other columns so that I'm left with just my index and my genre. The next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to select my genre column. I'm going to head up here to transform, and I'm going to go to split column. And because what I'm trying to do is I want to create new columns for each of these genres. And you can see that all the genres are separated by commas. So I'm going to go to split column. I'm going to split by a delimiter, and I'm going to specify that I want comma to be my delimiter. It's as you are noticing here, you can pick almost any kind of delimiter that you want to, and you can even select a custom delimiter if you have something strange in your data that you want to break out columns on. But a comma is fine for us. So I'm just going to hit OK, and you'll see that immediately it creates 5 columns breaking out all of the genres that were in that original genre field. So it looks like if I scroll all the way down through all 16,000 movies that are in this data set, the fact that there are 5 columns means that basically no other part of the data had more than just the 5. If you were in a situation where you thought, well, I'm only profiling based on 1,000 rows, what if farther down the data set there are more genre columns? Something that you can always do, just to be on the safe side, is you can go into your split column by delimiter transformation step. You can always add a few more columns if you're worried. Yep, looks like I forgot a comma somewhere. There we go. Okay. So now we've got up to 10 genre columns. They're all currently typed as text. That is fine. So what can we do now to take all of these genre columns and turn them into a simple dimension within our data that a user could use to filter the data set on? In other words, how do we take 10 columns and turn them into one feature? Well, it's really pretty easy. All we're going to do is we're going to select the first column in our data set. We're going to hold down Shift and grab the last column of our data set. And then we're going to go up to transform in our ribbon, and we're going to unpivot those columns. And now you can see that we have our index over here. We have this new attribute column that was created by performing the unpivot step. And this attribute column, you can see, is really fairly useless for our front end users. You know, as far as they're not going to know what genre point 1, genre point 2, genre point 3, what those stand for, and that's fine. What we're interested in is the fact that we have now created a column that contains one unique genre for a given row in this new table. And since we've performed that pivot, if you'll remember, our RT Movies main data set has 16,000 rows. Well, we know that this new table that we created that pivots out all of these genres is obviously going to have more than 16,000 rows, because each movie could contain, you know, between 5 and 10, let's say, genres. So I don't know how large this new table is going to be, but chances are it's probably, you know, between, let's say, 60,000 and 100,000 rows. And it might even surprise me when we load this in. But this is going to be a much longer table. That's why it's imperative that we have this index here, because, you know, just to kind of tease what we're going to do with this, with these tables once we're finished modeling, we're going to use this index to create a relationship to the index in our main table, so that we're going to be able to kind of tie everything back together. So as I said, this attribute column that Power BI creates automatically from the column names in our table before we performed the unpivot is really not useful to us. So we're just going to go ahead and remove it, which is really just hiding it. And if you go through the different items in our value field, which I'm going to relabel as genre, you'll notice that there are some weird spacing issues. A lot of these are spaces that are left over from the comma delimiters that we used to create new columns from our original genre field. So we're just going to click on our down arrow, make sure that, you know, we got everything as much as possible ironed out. Everything's looking good. And then we're just going to right click. We're going to transform, and we're going to trim to get rid of as many of those preceding or trailing spaces that were left over as possible, so that we have a clean, spaceless as much as possible, except for where acceptable, like in science fiction and fantasy, items for all of our genres. So we're going to have a nice genre slicer that we're going to make out of this new table that we created. And we're going to tie it back to our main movie ratings data source by using this index, which we're going to use as a key. So I'm going to go ahead and change this table name to movie genre. And we are done with our movie genre. Next, we're going to head back to our main data set. And we're going to do the same exercise for our director, our writer, and our cast. So I'm going to go ahead and just save us some time by duplicating this table a few more times. I'm going to call this one Movie Directors. Movie Writers. And Movie Cast. For movie directors, I'm going to want to keep everything except, I'm going to want to get rid of everything except for index and directors. So I'm going to grab index, I'm going to hold down control and grab director, and I'm going to remove all other columns. Next, I'm going to perform exactly the same option as before. I'm going to split by comma. And again, if you just want to be on the safe side, you can always go through and add a few more columns to your split, just in case farther down the data set we have a movie with, 6 or 7 directors. Seems pretty unlikely, but you never know. And once we have all of that done, we're going to just hold down Shift, grab all of our director columns. We're going to go ahead and unpivot. Let me make sure I'm on the right step. There we go. Next, we're going to remove the attribute column that's not particularly helpful. We're going to we're going to transform rather by trimming any of the excess spaces that are in here. And now we're going to, I know for a fact that there are at least a few movies in here that have the same director's name listed multiple times. So this might also be a place where if you want to highlight the whole table and remove duplicates, you can go ahead and do that. Looks like I've still got Jean-Baptiste Andrea. So there must be something going on in one of these values. Yeah, you can see that they're not spelled exactly the same way. So while we could go and clean this up, unfortunately, this is one of those one-offs where it's really difficult to programmatically fix these types of issues where a director's name could be spelled multiple times. And we know that logically, these two directors are likely the same person. It's just really hard to programmatically anticipate all of these possible spelling changes. It's also not really material to the front end that we're probably going to be creating. The worst case scenario is that somebody searches this director's name, both times to find all of the movies that belong to this director. So again, not a lot that we can do to really clean that up. Kind of sucks, but there we are. Ditto with this director up here whose name is clearly Greg Jacobs, but appears 3 different ways, presumably across the entire data set. We're just going to leave that as is for now. We're going to call this column director, or directors, since there are multiple. Let's go ahead and just make it director. Now we're going to go ahead and do this exact same exercise with our writers. We're going to make sure that we've grabbed our index, grab our writer column, remove all other columns, go up to split by delimiter. Since it looks like some of the movies here have up to 6 writers, I'm going to go ahead and just create 10 columns. There we go. Now I'm going to go ahead and use Shift Select to grab all 10 of my writer columns. I'm going to unpivot these, hide the attribute, and of course, as always, go through and transform and trim to remove all the excess spaces from my value column, which I will now rename writer. And one thing that I want to point out as I've been doing this, just in case you didn't notice, is while I'm creating additional columns to sort of catch all the possible writers that could exist in this table, notice that I have all of these nulls. Notice that those nulls are being collapsed when I perform the unpivot. That's why these columns, adding these additional columns doesn't really cost us anything, and it's not really something that we need to worry about, because as we unpivot, those values that don't have anything in them get automatically sort of cut out of the data. So we're safe to kind of include those columns when we're performing the unpivot maneuver. Okay, now I've got all of my writers. The last thing to do is my movie cast, which is obviously going to be the longest table in this entire data set, just because any of these 16,000 members probably has, a dozen, upwards of, 40 or 50 actors, I would guess. So let's go ahead and select our index and select our cast column. We're going to remove everything else. We're going to go ahead and head in here and split by comma. And this time you can see I'm going to have, upwards of 149 cast members. So I'm going to go ahead and go up to my split column by delimiter, and I am just going to make things a little bit easier on myself. I'm going to create some new columns, but I'm going to give myself a little bit more space to work with down here. I'm not going to get too crazy. Like if you're sitting here thinking, oh my God, Sean's going to go to 200. I'm not. I'm actually just going to go to about 175 on this, just giving myself some additional columns to work with here for the unpivot transformation step that we know is coming up next. There we go. I've now got some additional trailing columns that I'm just going to spot check real quickly and make sure that they're all formatted correctly. They look good to me. Next, we're just going to head back to the beginning of the table, grab cast 1, grab cast 175, and perform the same unpivot step that we've been doing. Up to this point, we're going to go ahead and remove the attribute column. I'm going to change the new value column to actor instead of cast. And I'm going to right click on the header at the top of the column. I'm going to transform this column by trimming any excess spaces. And everything is looking much better to me. Now that we have new tables for genre, director, writers, and cast, we no longer need to keep that excess information in our main table. So I'm just going to go ahead and remove those columns. Now we have a much leaner fact table. And let's go ahead and run with this for now. Obviously, if we want to come back later and make more changes, we can do that. But for now, I'm going to go ahead and close and apply. And let's see how large these unpivoted tables are. Everything seems to have processed pretty quickly. And you can see that our movie cast table is 418,000 rows, which again, not very surprising. You know, we would expect that these movies would have pretty large casts for the most part. Director's table is about 18,000. I think that I thought the genre column was going to be about 60,000. Not even all that bad, 37,000. So it looks like each movie must have roughly had about 2 genres assigned to it, 2.5, and 28,000 writers. And then our main data set here is 16,638 rows. Okay, so everything's great. Next, let's go to our model. And you can see the Power BI went ahead and detected our index columns on its own. So everything is already modeled and looks good to me as far as our schema is concerned. You can see our index column always points to index. So we're in pretty good shape as far as our model is concerned. We are ready to start visualizing this data set, which I will be covering in the next video. So thank you so much for joining me for this Power Query tutorial. Obviously, that was a pretty simple table. Things can get really, really complicated in a hurry in the Power Query editor, but I just wanted to keep this as a fairly straightforward, simple tutorial. I feel like a lot of people understand how a movie data set would work. So we just walked through some basic transformations that are pretty par for the course for me when using the Power Query editor. just some quick cleanup that we have to do in order to create, a performative model behind the scenes that we're going to be able to use to create, a pretty fun front end. So join me for the next video, and we'll start doing some of the fun work of actually building some data visuals and working on our design for this movie tool report. Thank you so much.